What a privilege to be with you today to share the Word of God. I am going to pick up on a message that was preached, well, it started about 3 weeks ago. Alan started a series called No Ordinary Life. And the first message was believing for the impossible. The second one was on forgiveness. And then we had Sinani Sunday. How amazing was that? What a beautiful Sunday that was. And today we're going to pick up on No Ordinary Life. And the title for today's message is Blasting Out of the Ordinary. God comes into my ordinary life, and he wants to blast me out of the ordinary, to give you and I an extraordinary life. He did that when he called the disciples. He went to Peter, an ordinary fisherman, and he said, "Follow me and I will make you a fisher of men." He went to Moses, who was this prince who was demoted to become a shepherd, and he said, "Drop your staff." And when Moses dropped his staff, he said, "Pick it up again. And once you pick it up, you will go from being a shepherd tending sheep in the wilderness to walking my people through the wilderness to find freedom in God." And so he also does this incredible conversion, this transformation for you and I. And so we're going to look at that. He's into this realm of converting fishermen into fishers of men. He likes to take caterpillars and turn them into butterflies. And if I'm to honor the graphic designer, he likes to take donkeys and turn them into zebras. And how does he do his transformational work? We're going to look at that. We're going to look at the story of Jonah and extract some characteristics. And Jonah is an unlikely figure to look at because he didn't really get blasted out of the extraordinary. The only place he got blasted out of was he got projectile vomited by a whale, right? But we're going to take a look at Jonah and see how does this flawed prophet become used by God to be given an extraordinary life. So just bear with me. It's only 4 chapters, but I'm quickly gonna summarize the book, okay? Jonah starts with God going to call him, and it says, "The word of the Lord came to Jonah, son of Amittai. Go to the great city of Nineveh and preach against it, because its wickedness has come up before me." But Jonah ran away from the Lord and headed for Tarshish. He went down to Joppa, where he found a ship bound for that port. After paying the fare, he went aboard and sailed for Tarshish to flee from the Lord. So the book of Jonah is God giving this prophet an assignment, and Jonah runs in the opposite direction, jumps on a ship, he goes to the hull, falls asleep. God sends the storm to wake him up. All the sailors are panicking. They go and wake up Jonah. They cast lots and see that it's him. They go to him and say, "God has shown us that you are the problem. What have you done?" And he said, "I'm running away from God." And the sailors become terrified and say, "Well, what should we do now?" And he says, "Throw me overboard." And these sailors don't want innocent blood on their hands, so they start to row and try to get the ship to safety through the storm. And once they realize they can't, they ask God for forgiveness and throw Jonah over. I mean, you've got to read the story on your own. I'm not doing it justice. God sends this huge fish to swallow up Jonah, and it's in the belly of the whale that he just makes this desperate prayer to God. And God answers him by commanding the fish to vomit him out. God goes to him again and says, "Now go and preach to Nineveh, because their wickedness is great and I want to judge them in punishment." And so he responds. But when he responds and preaches in Nineveh, the people repent. The people are cut in the heart. They wear sackcloth, cover themselves with ashes. They fast. Even the king does so. And after preaching, Jonah leaves the town, sits with a good view of the city, 120,000 people, and realizes God is not going to destroy them. God had mercy because of their repentance. He has this angry exchange with God, saying, God, I knew you were a merciful God, and I didn't want your compassion on them. And God allows Jonah in the wilderness to have this plant grow over him. I mean, a wild story in the heat of the wilderness. This plant provides him shade. He's comforted. The next day, God sends a scorching wind, and the plant withers. And Jonah gets so upset, again, having to sit in the hot sun, throws his toys out of the cradle and says, God, it's better you just kill me. I'm so angry. I'm angry that you've forgiven these guys. I'm angry that I'm in this hot sun. Once the worm eats this plant. Sorry, it was the worm that ate the plant. You can take points off my Sunday school memory. And then God goes to Jonah and says, you're so worried about this plant that you didn't even make. And you're so angry that this plant was destroyed. And how much more should I be concerned about a city of 120,000 who don't know their right hand from their left, including animals? So what are some characteristics we can draw out of this fantastical story? There's 3 points we'll cover today. Number 1, bothering God. To have an extraordinary life, we need to bother God. The second point is we need boldness to step into the extraordinary. And the third one is beholding new horizons. So to experience this launching, we need to bother God. Jonah couldn't be bothered with God until he became desperate. Then he began to bother God. He began to cry out. And so to bother God, we need this gift. We need a gift of desperation. Are you desperate for God this morning? He's desperate for you. The communion that we had this morning is an illustration of just how desperate he is for you and I. That he has shed his blood on the cross just so he can win us. I have an incredible friend. He's an Iranian pastor, right now pastoring a church in Toronto, Canada. Toronto has about 100,000 Iranians. I'm one of them. And we have Farsi-speaking churches springing up now. But this pastor became a Christian. He found Christ while he was fleeing Iran, and he couldn't get a visa as a skilled worker, so he went what the South Africans call the Madala way. He went to Holland, and then he went from Holland to Vienna, and then Denmark, before going to Germany and meeting his wife. Then they went to Canada. Obviously now he's a pastor in a church called Spirit of Truth. And he greets you guys, by the way. I had a video call with him just to confirm his story. So he said, send the church in South Africa my greeting. So the Spirit of Truth Church says hello. And he told me about how he went to Denmark with no papers, with no job. The immigration lawyer said, what are you trying to do? Like, you're walking into a dead end. And he said, your only option is to try and apply for asylum, but it's not looking good. So he applied for refugee status while staying in an asylum shelter, which is a bit like a homeless shelter. And he said he didn't have much hope. And every day he would cry. And he said, one day I cried so much I fainted. And his neighbor came and said, tomorrow on Monday, there's some people speaking English and they're coming and talking about God. Do you want to join? And he said, sure. And he went to their meeting. They were Jehovah's Witnesses. And they gave him a Bible, and he went to his room and began to read the Bible starting in Genesis. And he said, God began to speak to me, and he answered hundreds of questions. And as he was addressing my life, I began to have hundreds of my own questions, and I wrote them down, and I went to those guys with all my questions, and they were overwhelmed to see my double-sided piece of paper with all my questions. They said, we'll put you in touch with our headquarters in New York City. And he said, don't worry about it. And he went to his room, and he just prayed. And he said, God, as I read Genesis, I see you speak to Abraham, and he didn't have a Bible. If you are the source of this book, which I believe you are, and if you answer prayers, and if you reveal yourself to Abraham, reveal yourself to me. And God revealed himself to this man, and he began to have an unexplainable joy. And the next morning, he said he walked into the office of the shelter he was staying in. Those shelters usually have some security personnel, immigration advice, nurses, doctors. And he walked in, and they looked at him and they said, you're beaming. Why are you so happy? Did you get an answer for your status? Did you get a job? And he said, no, I still have nothing. But I found this book. And the Danish staff were so shocked and perplexed and a bit offended. They're like, what do you mean you found this book? He said, I found the Holy Bible. And they said, that is ridiculous. And he said, do you guys have problems in Denmark? They said, yes. I never thought the Danish had any problems. But he said, you know why you have problems in this country? Because you've turned away from this book. You've stopped being desperate for this book. And he said, they just asked me to leave the office. The gift of desperation. We see this man go to a European country that is declining in statistics in desperation. And this one desperate guy is launched by God and now has a beautiful congregation, he and his wife, in Toronto. Are you and I desperate for God? Because when we are, he will launch us. And I suggest that today, if you're not desperate for him, be real with him. Some of my times with God were simply telling him, God, I'm not desperate for you, but I want to be. And he works on my life through that. Desperation is to be a disposition. A friend of mine said, Farzam, I only go to God when I'm in crisis. Then he helps me, then I forget about him. Then I'm in another crisis and I go to him again. That's not a helpful, peaceful disposition. Our disposition is to continually draw near to God with hungry and thirsty minds. And James 4:8 says that we are not to be double-minded. Keep flipping and flopping. And let's also keep in mind about our role in other people's lives. Sometimes we need to let somebody get desperate. I'm not saying we need to be cruel. Even the fishermen, even the sailors tried to save Jonah, didn't they? But there was a point that they had to surrender him, to wrestle things out with God, and to express his desperation. My friend Isaac, who was an alcoholic, said, Farzam, my life changed the day my mom packed my suitcase, gave me my bag, and said, you have to leave the house, and I'm handing you over to God. And she then prayed for him. And he said, that's when I started to encounter God. And he became an incredible recovery coach at Bread of Life Recovery in Sabi. Sadly, he died last year of cancer. He's greatly mourned there. But everyone at the rehab says Isaac was the guy who continually said, we need to surrender people to God. Doesn't mean we're not loving and caring. Doesn't mean we don't try to row someone to safety. But in your discernment with God, you need to discern when is the right time to allow someone to do business with God on their own. Then they will bother God. And when we bother God, we're actually not bothering him. He's a loving Father who answers. The other thing that allows us to bother God is when we're willing to overcome scandal. For Jonah, it was scandalous for him to go to Nineveh. We can't blame the guy. The people of Nineveh were Assyrians. The Assyrians did incredible injustice. They were the powerhouse of the time. They are credited to sieging Israel so harshly that the Israelites had to eat their own children. And now God is calling Jonah to go to those people that made him suffer so much. It's scandalous. But sometimes God asks us to take a posture that dents our dignity. When Alan started this series, didn't he speak about a blind man who heard of Jesus passing by? And he just was shouting, "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me." And everyone around him was saying, "Quiet, shh, the rabbi is passing by. Don't be so undignified." But he didn't care. He was willing to face the scandal of being desperate for God, put down his dignity and continue to shout. And through that, he was the only one that day that was launched, that experienced the miracle of God. I have gone for years, and I continue to go to addiction support groups. I'm a recovering addict myself, and it's puzzling how you can sit in a circle and share of your most shameful actions. And when you do, the presence of God fills the room. Like, I've driven home from support groups perplexed that why, God, when we share the most undignified aspects of our lives, when we share that, why does it suddenly become holy ground? In the book of Genesis, it said, Adam and Eve were naked and they felt no shame. And you and I are so good at covering up the shame with different things. And sometimes in order for God to launch us, he asks us to take away the leaves so he can truly clothe us with grace, peace, and forgiveness. And so Jonah had to face this scandal. And he faced it in the belly of the whale. He was feeling too much dignity to go and preach to his enemies. But in the belly of the whale, he wrestled it out with God. He has this incredible prayer. In my distress, I called to you, Lord, and he answered me. From the deep in the realm of the dead, I called for help, and you listened to my cry. And when he dared to be desperate for God, when he dared to put his dignity to the side, God answered. And what did Jonah become? He became whale vomit. My friend Ryan, who goes to this church, loves to speak about Jonah. So I said, I'd love to speak on Jonah. Can you tell me some things? So he sent me a long voice note. So if you have any problems with the theology today, you can speak to Ryan. He said, whale vomit actually has a name. It's called Ambergris. And it's extremely valuable. About a year ago, they found 10 kilograms of ambergris in the ocean, and they sold it for $500,000, 9 million rand. And ambergris is used to make perfume in the very high market perfume market. And it's so incredible that arguably Jonah's most disgraceful moment of his life, when he seemed the most broken and undignified, was also the moment that he became ambergris, a valuable, fragrant, precious treasure. So let's not shy about bothering God. Let's be desperate for him. Let's overcome our own egos and what we think is our self-imposed dignity. And let's accept that it might not be pretty. Second point, boldness to step into the extraordinary. In order to have an extraordinary life, we need boldness to step into it. But it's not a human boldness. It's not like a rah, let's conquer the world boldness. I know of this Korean church that had a missionary in Afghanistan ministering to the Taliban. And this guy visited his Korean church and he got them so excited that a bunch of them decided to go to Afghanistan, but they were kidnapped by the Taliban and a bunch of them renounced their faith at gunpoint. So let's not confuse boldness with emotionalism. There was a time I was in architecture school and I had just come to Christ, and I filled out my dropout papers because I wanted to serve God. And I filled out my papers. I said, I told one of my friends who was a more mature Christian than me, I want to leave architecture school and I want to go somewhere and serve God. And he said, no, I think you're making a huge mistake. Just wait. I think, Farzam, this is your impulsiveness. Wait. Ima. Vachapiki. Don't rush it. Don't respond with your emotions. This is not the boldness we're talking about. The boldness to step into the extraordinary is the boldness of that woman who is bleeding for years, and she sees Jesus walking by with the crowd, and she knows that even if she goes out and rubs shoulder with someone, because she is ceremonially unclean, she will make someone else unclean. And in her, perhaps, desperation and fear and maybe trembling, she decided to have that faith to step out into the sunlight where she had been exempt from in a crowd and just touch the edge of his garment. And when Jesus healed her, he said, "Woman, your faith has made you well." So boldness is to simply have faith, to take a step, sometimes amidst fear and timidity. God's call into an extraordinary life is not ordinary, but obvious. You know, his call to us is so not ordinary, it's so outside of normal sometimes that we might even say no, like Jonah did. Has God asked you to obey in an area that doesn't make sense to you? Perhaps you're here in this church and that doesn't make sense to you. The first time I walked into a church, I said, I don't know why I'm here. I was in university and I was a brand new Christian, and I'm sitting down. It's a break between two classes and I decide to buy and eat a hot dog. You guys call them Russians. I don't know why you call them Russians. My brother-in-law is a Russian from Canada. He visited me this year. You guys traumatized him. Wherever we went on the side of buildings, Russians and chips. You know people have crazy ideas about visiting Africa. Why you say that you're eating Russians and chips? You guys have to fix that. The election's coming up. Come on now. So I'm eating this hot dog. This food is cursed. In North America, they think we eat dogs. In South Africa, they think we're eating Russians. I'm eating this thing. Nobody knows what it is, by the way. It's just like hooves and animal skin, everything's... Anyways, I'm eating this thing. A Korean man approaches me, a middle-aged guy, and says, "Do you want to study the Bible?" I'm a brand new Christian. And I look at him and I say, "No, thank you. I'm already a Christian." And then he laughs and says, "It's okay. Even Christians can study the Bible." I have one-on-one Bible studies, and you're welcome to come and study the Bible with me one-on-one on Monday evening. Give it a try. So I took his card and I went and I prayed and I sensed God. I just told God, "God, this is weird." And I sensed him just say, "Try." And I went and we started in Genesis 1:1. And for the next 3 or 4 years, Charles Kim became my one-on-one Bible study tutor. And he couldn't even say my name properly. My name is Farzam. Many Koreans can't pronounce F and Z, so he would call me Parjam. It was weird. He was a banker, working in the Bank of Montreal, and every Monday evening he'd teach me the Bible. And then other days he'd have appointments with other students. We'd get together sometimes once a month and have a meal together, engineers and mathematicians and fashion designers, and I was an architecture student, and he would tell us, you guys are a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. It wasn't normal, it wasn't ordinary. Why was this banker leaving in the evening and coming to teach some university students in a secular city, in a secular university? The fact that I said yes led God to do some work through my life. The fact that Charles Kim said yes to God's calling as a banker meant that he has blessed I don't know how many students. He calls us into not ordinary lives, and we praise him for that. The other thing about this is he asks us to step into the extraordinary one step at a time. Psalm 119, verse 105 says, your word is a lamp for my feet and a light on my path. It's not for you and I to decide how wide the beam is that he shines onto our feet or onto our path. Sometimes the light is just enough for the next step, isn't it? It's not for you and I to decide. We take this extraordinary journey one step at a time. And sometimes we get a glimpse a little bit further. You ever been in a thunderstorm at night and suddenly the lightning comes and for a second you can see as clear as day? It's a bit creepy, eh? For that split second, he might give you a bigger vision. For that split second, he told Peter, I will make you a fisher of men. It's mystical, it's mysterious. And Peter had to walk it out, though, most of the time, one step at a time. And so it is for you and I. With Jonah, he walked him through one step at a time. Jonah first said no. And he took him on a journey. And as my friend Ryan says, God used the whale to change Jonah's mind about preaching to his enemies, but his heart remained angry. But then God used the worm to change Jonah's heart. And it was this step-by-step walk of this very flawed prophet that led to him being used by God to save lives of 120,000 people and then animals. And Jesus compares himself to Jonah. For as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of a huge fish, so the Son of Man will be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. What is God calling you to, and who is God calling you to? I just know it's not going to be ordinary, and I know it's going to be one step at a time. And Max shared in the first service about God calling Elijah through a whisper. Most of the time in my life, when he calls me to take that step, there's been a few earthquakes that he's called me very vividly, but most of it has been just this whisper. Just take that one step. And once I do, he shows us the next one. Isn't that true? He's a good, good father. The last point is beholding new horizons. Jonah preaches to the city. He goes a distance away on the east side and he just looks on the horizon, expecting God's judgment to rain down and destroy them. But God doesn't do that, does he? Through God's response, he extends Jonah's horizon. Is God extending your horizon as you walk with him? And I believe that's why the book of Jonah ends with a question. God asked Jonah, should I not have compassion? And he waits for him to answer as he waits for you and I. Where is our horizon? You know, religion can be a dangerous thing. Religion can quickly, if we're not careful, turn into tribalism, protecting ourselves, preserving ourselves and our values at the expense of showing empathy and love, sacrificial service to the entire culture that we're in. Which is why Jesus doesn't call us to religion. He calls us into relationship. And he continually asks us to broaden our horizons, lift up our eyes. In Toronto, we were involved in establishing a church plant with a few couples, and it's still going today. And one of the couples, after a few years, said, God is calling us to go to Indonesia. And they said, he's not just calling us to go there, he's calling us to move into a slum. And to this day, they live with their children in a garbage collecting slum. That's how most of the people make their money, collecting garbage and sorting recycling. And their children are sometimes begging on the streets. And they've built themselves a little 2-story house, and the ground floor is just a giant schoolroom where all the kids in the neighborhood can come and get school help, play, learn. And Chrissy, I heard her speak once. She said, I actually really like nice houses and nice neighborhoods. And sometimes on my off days, I take our car and I drive through the most beautiful neighborhood I can find. And I love that. But I love so much more who God has called us to. I love so much more seeing the youth who come and visit us in this garbage collecting slum become transformed through the presence of God and become agents in their community. And I see in Chrissy a woman who is looking at a new horizon and is tasting bread, as Jesus calls it, that sometimes I know nothing about. And it came up last week in Sinani Sunday. This verse was read a few times, Isaiah 45:3. I will give you the treasures of darkness, riches stored in secret places. Sometimes God calls us to a horizon that might seem dark, but when we actually go there, we realize, man, there's so much treasure. This is like a secret storehouse of riches from the kingdom. And he calls us to those horizons. And as I was preparing this part, just the image of a seed came. Doesn't a tree pop its head above the horizon? But in order to pop above the horizon, the tree is first the seed. And what must you do with a seed? So before it can go above the horizon, God might put you and I in a dark place. And Jesus says, as I died on the cross to bring you life, if you carry your cross and you die to self, I will show you horizons that contain the greatest riches and bring the deepest peace. Living an extraordinary life. We need to bother God. We need boldness to step into what he has for us, one step at a time. And we need to be willing for him to direct our eyes to new horizons. And none of this is possible without the Holy Spirit, is it? We need the Spirit to indwell us and to fill us and to draw us to where he wants us to launch. Even Jesus himself said in John 5:19-21, truly, truly, I tell you, the Son can do nothing by himself unless he sees the Father doing it. For whatever the Father does, the Son also does. The Father loves the Son and shows him all he does, and to your amazement, he will show him even greater works than these. For just as the Father raises the dead and gives them life, so also the Son gives life to whom he wishes. Do we want this life? Do we want this extraordinary life? And if we do, let us press into an incredible God.